And welcome to another edition of Carnivore Bites. I'm your host, Jeff Sherman, with Dr. Eric Lopkin. And it's our last podcast before the holiday season. We'll be off next week, correct, Dr. Lopkin?
That's correct. As we're heading into the holidays and the new year.
Amazing
And
time.
let's face it,
obviously
2022 has been one heck of a year. We've never had a shortage of topics to talk about.
No, there was actually a time we might actually have to scratch our heads. Those days are over, except if we have an itch. Anyway,
Yep.
So first topic on the docket is January 6th committee criminal referrals with Donald Trump. And also, the legality is obviously in question, but that will be happening. Plus, we have his tax returns being issued in public for public display. And I think there's at least 5 years that he lost money, at least on his tax returns. Any takeaways from this?
Well, legal experts on both sides of the aisle have already come out and said the DOJ will probably decline prosecution.
Yeah, yes.
The fact of the matter is, with all of the hearings, with all of the investigations, the January 6th committee failed to come up with a single piece of evidence that actually tied Donald Trump to the January 6th riots. It's more likely that he was an excuse by very disgruntled individuals. Should he have done more to stop it? Yes, absolutely.
No
But
doubt.
was he responsible for them? There was no evidence to suggest that. But the January 6th committee can't admit that, because then they have to admit that they were a waste of taxpayer money. It was a political witch hunt, and God forbid they should actually cop to that. So they pass it off to the DOJ, and the DOJ goes, yeah, there's nothing here. We're not going to prosecute.
I think that was a good summation of the whole January 6th situation in its actuality. My takeaway is complete lack of judgment by Donald Trump. He did not willingly, cause the so-called insurrection, did nothing to quell it once it was done, but nothing legally. Now, in terms of judgmentally, in terms of his own judgment, I think there is something there, but legally not. Your comment?
Yeah, that's the big thing. He made some comments that, taken out of context, the January 6th committee ran with. Should he have said those things? No. Should he have, called for calm, called for, not to march? Probably. But legally, he did nothing wrong. And that's the key. See, Democrats seem to have forgotten that impeachment is a legal proceeding. Prosecution is a legal proceeding. These are not, we don't like you, we're going to prosecute and impeach you. No,
I think
you
you have
are
a really
supposed.
good point, Doctor. No, you have a great point, Dr. Lockwood. Isn't that a broader issue with liberalism in its entirety? Nothing's about the actuality of something. It's the emotion of something. And
Yes,
it's
that's actually
transcended
very.
and infused itself into the impeachment hearings. Because I
Yes,
don't
that's
like
very
something
well.
gives me. Go ahead. Sorry.
That's very well stated. They have completely forgotten that these are legal proceedings. And the perfect example is a chain of stores called Pensis Spices. The owner of this chain spent a small fortune on commercials to convince people that Trump needed to be impeached. Okay, this is not a popularity contest. Impeachment is a court proceeding. Public opinion doesn't enter into it. But you had this guy spending a fortune trying to convince people as though it was just a matter of, well, if people don't like him, we can impeach him.
Well,
Now,
it
he
is.
got his come up. What?
Yes, he got his comeuppance, but even before he took office, geniuses, in the Democratic Party were calling for impeachment. I mean, amazing.
Yeah, before anything had been done, there was no reason for impeachment. But the guy from Pence's Spices got his comeuppance because his customers left in droves, to the point where last year he was begging people to buy gift cards to keep him in business.
Well, speaking of the business angle of liberalism, this was not something we discussed in preparation for the podcast, but interesting, Disney had its worst year in terms of stock performance since 1974. Long time ago.
Uh, Yes, and this is a case of what we've been terming go woke, go broke. And in fact, just this past week, Disney saw their stock plummet because they released the long awaited sequel to Avatar, and it was a woke piece of garbage, just basically going, oh, we have to save the environment. There was no story to it, no special effects that weren't already in the first one and are old hat now. And the movie did $100 million less than expected, and it caused the stock to tank. This is what happens when you put woke politics above good business, and Disney is
It,
suffering the consequences.
it did do better than AOC's global warming documentary, though.
my
That's
my home movies do better than AOC's documentary on global warming.
there you go. Absolutely. The border crisis, something that's been neglected and overlooked. Why do you think that's the case? I know there's a liberal bias, but I feel like, it is a major, major, major story with huge implications, both economically, politically, socially. If you look at Laura O'Donnell from Channel, or I should say CBS,
CBS.
there's no report. Why is that, and what's going on here?
No, because they thought it was going to stay on the border. They thought it would stay in Texas. They thought it would stay in Arizona, in the red states. So, of course, they didn't care. And they were very proud to say, New York is a sanctuary city, Massachusetts is a sanctuary state. And then when the migrants started being shipped to these sanctuary cities, suddenly they went, well, wait a minute, we don't have the money to take care of all these people. Well, you should have thought about that before you declared yourself a sanctuary city. But
And the
now,
perfect example of
it's,
that is California, isn't it, Dr. Lockton?
yes, Gavin Newsom is now saying we have to shut the border, we have to do something about this. And the big problem is that the White House's answer has been, well, give me more money to throw at the problem. No, money is not the problem. Your policies are the problem. Fix the policies. And of course, every time a reporter asks the White House about this, they say, well, the Republicans haven't worked with us. And that's because they keep saying they're not going to do anything unless they can do comprehensive immigration reform. Well, guess what? That's like saying you want to rebuild the house while it's still on fire and not worry about putting out the fire. You can't do that. You have to put out the fire first and then rebuild the house.
That's obviously a political positioning. Anyone would know that. You have a huge crisis. Um, they had an opportunity when they had both houses to do something. They chose not to, didn't they?
Well, they chose not to. And I think more important, this was less on the Democrat side an issue about immigration or an issue about border security. Under the Trump administration, a border wall was being built. Border illegal immigration was down, and on the first week that Biden took office, he dismantled everything that Trump had done. Now, I'm not
Why
saying
is the
Trump's
question?
immigration policies were perfect, but
Why
they
was
were
that?
working, right? They
Why
were
was that?
working. And the Democrats could not stand to leave anything that Trump did in place.
Well, I also think it's bigger than that. I think it's uh, the
I don't know, radicalization of the Democratic Party, because I think 30 years ago they were pretty much on board with a relatively secure border. I mean, Jimmy Carter didn't have an open border policy, okay? Somewhere, somehow, it got convoluted like the rest of the party, and now open borders is part of essentially their platform. And since
Yeah,
Biden,
they've
his brain is like cheese, he's not in control. He would be the old Joe Biden would be for a secure border, but because other people are in charge, ex-Obama officials, they see this as an opportunity.
Yeah, it is amazing how far to the left the Democrats have gone. In the past, Joe Biden has called for a secure border and voted for fencing along the border. Nancy Pelosi has called for a secure border and voted for fencing along the border. Chuck Schumer called for a secure border and voted for fencing along the border. But because Trump actually started doing it, oh, no, 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 no. We can't have that. We've got to go further to the left. It's absolutely ridiculous. They've left common sense behind. And we've heard the phrase over and over again from politicians, from public figures, from comedians. I didn't change my thinking. The Democratic Party left me. And that's what they've done. And if they don't move back to the center, they are going to self destruct. And by the same token, we're starting to see things in the Republican Party where they want to move further to the right. And if they do that, if that actually succeeds, they will self destruct.
And I would also add to that, if Trump still is the quasi leader of the party, that is also self destruction. I believe he's at this point radioactive.
That's absolutely true. I think that's less of a problem though, because I think his days are over. I think even though he's still technically the head of the Republican Party, most of the party has already moved away from him. So
You
at
mean
least they're
you
doing
didn't buy
that.
his trading cards?
I did not buy his NFT digital trading card. No, and that was just something. Honestly, Trump was trying to jump on a dying trend. NFTs were big for a while until people realized there was no actual value to these things, and now just as cryptocurrency is falling apart, the NFT market has fallen apart. As a businessman, you can't really fault Trump for trying to jump on that bad bandwagon and grab some of the money before it's all gone. But NFTs were moronic to begin with. A Trump NFT, it was like, if you bought it, best of luck. You've got a worthless collectible.
Yes, but I also think it's indicative of what we've talked about on this podcast for almost years now. Is he made that announcement, but he also had a announcement later on in that afternoon that was really quite presidential. But again, no one paid attention to it because they thought this was insane. And I actually agree with that. So again, shooting himself in the foot, and if you're trying to rebuild yourself, if you are the media king, so to speak, not a very not a very presidential situation. Um, we also have the continuing laptop, Hunter Biden laptop mill cover up. And they were talking about how the security state, knowing that it was probably real, still lied. Is the security state, is the FBI, do they need to be cleansed and revamped because they're essentially an arm of the swamp and of the Democratic Party.
The FBI, I don't even know if you can cleanse it at this point. Um, I actually think you need to start from the ground up and build a new law enforcement agency because the FBI has been so corrupt for so long. I don't even think there's anything that you can do to fix it because it goes beyond the Hunter Biden laptop. We've talked about this before where going all the way back to J. Edgar Hoover, they were a political arm of, in that case, they were of the right. Now they're a political arm of the left. But now there was talk that the National Archives was going to release information about the JFK assassination. And
Mm-hmm.
the Biden administration has balked at that. They're trying to keep the information from being released. But there has been rumors and innuendo that one of the reasons that they don't want to release this information is that it shows that the FBI was corrupt back then, back in '62.
Oh, there's no question about it.
So,
even with Martin Luther King and Hoover,
right.
without any question.
So we're talking about an alleged law enforcement agency.
Alleged, yes.
Yes, that has been a political arm of both parties at different times. Their track record is not the greatest.
No, but I think they've taken it to a new level when you're raiding 70-year-old Republican operatives with machine guns. That's a little over the top. Please stop it.
Well, but remember, this is also the same organization that under the Obama administration raided the offices of the Associated Press, violating freedom of the press to get their records. So this is obviously not a law enforcement agency, if it ever was. We talked last week about the ongoing failures of our intelligence agencies. I really think we need to do a full audit on the entire government. I mean, why does the IRS need 87,000 new agents to do their job? What is the government really doing? And I think you're going to find, because most of the jobs within these government agencies are political appointees and political favors to people, you're going to find this incredible cesspool of incompetence. And
no, you nailed it. Cesspool of incompetence, because it's exactly what it is. You have that in the State Department. You have that in other places. It's not like, the J. Edgar Hoover days. I know he had his problems, but there was a high level of competency, I believe. They got a lot of things right, but now you have a political hacks that have no idea which end is up.
And that's it. And I mean, unfortunately, this seems to be the case of our entire government. I mean,
of course, CIA, everything, yes.
And not just agencies, but important officials. Let's bring in Mayor Pete, who Mayor Pete during the supply chain emergency was out on paternity leave. Now, when the rails were going to go on strike, he was on vacation.
Well, I think it's a really interesting point. I think basically political correctness was the fuel that ascended him to where he is. But I think his ship has sailed as well.
Yeah, I mean,
I think he even knows that. He never did things with the seriousness of actually, like supply chain maternity leave. I mean, we won't even go there. But, yeah, again, it's a couple of weeks, but you took like 2 months during the height of a crisis. I think he's given up, and I think he knows that his ship has sailed. That's my honest assessment. He doesn't really give a shit at this point.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think he realizes his ship has sailed. But this is the problem we're having with political appointees. And let's be clear, this is not a Democratic problem or a
No, not at all.
Republican problem. This is a political problem. Both parties are equally guilty. They do it all the time. And it's time the American people stopped blindly voting for a party and started looking at what these idiots are doing.
100% agreed. No question about it. And I think Richard Blumenthal and Chris Murphy from our own great state of Connecticut are excellent examples of that. But anyway,
Oh, yeah.
so on, I guess, lighter notes, this is kind of interesting to me. While we were doing our research for the podcast, this came my way, and that is Keith Olbermann. And to put it in context, he started at ESPN. I think he's probably close to 70 now, but I'm talking like 30 years ago. He was like the cool guy. Remember, he even did a
Yep.
Subway commercial. It was still on ESPN. He was it. And then he went to MSNBC, which was a different network now. Now it's actually unwatchable. That's another issue. But he did Countdown with Keith Olbermann. I think number one show in cable. I have to say, I have to believe, not say, I have to believe it was a number one show. Fired from Gore's network. Essentially, if he was on Carnivore Radio, he would be fired. I mean, the guy is, I think he's got issues. And you don't have to be Sigmund Freud to figure that out.
Yeah, and again, just to clarify, he didn't choose to go to MSNBC from ESPN. ESPN fired him, and then MSNBC fired him. And I think he was actually on Fox for a little bit, and they fired him.
And no, he was also on Gore's network, whatever it was called. I forgot what it was called. It was sold off. He was on there for about a week. He was.
Yeah, they fired him. He has been fired from every network he has ever worked at because
I hope he saved his money.
He is impossible to work with, and he just doesn't care to deal with people. He won't take a direction. And every network has fired him. And it's hysterical that he still thinks his voice matters.
It does not matter.
He's been railing about Elon Musk and Twitter. And finally, the only reason we're talking about it, the only reason anybody even remembers him now is because Musk actually kicked him off of Twitter for a couple of days.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because even about his show, which was over 10 years ago on MSNBC's Countdown, it was funny. It wasn't like a political. And then I think I'm going to have to say this. I think his psychological problems took over. He became this angry, kind of psychopathic guy, just ranting, and it was unwatchable. And then he eventually got fired. He probably had these issues behind the scenes, but he was so popular they kept him on. But once his popularity started to ebb, I think they said, "Okay, buddy, you're out of here." And I think he's done. It's kind of sad. Don't really care, but he was this rock star at ESPN and rock star at MS, and then he's become irrelevant for the last 10 years. He's probably just an angry guy that, God bless him. What can I tell you?
Actually, I think there's a lot of similarities between him and Donald Trump. And that they always put their own needs first. They didn't care about what was going on. Their ego overrode everything. The difference is Trump was actually successful enough that he was able to ride that out up until the presidency, where Olbermann didn't have that.
A great analysis. I think that's 100% true. They also had both self-destructive psychological makeups. Right when they were at the pinnacle to succeed, they sabotaged themselves, the both of them.
Yes.
And they have no one to blame but themselves. Speaking of no one to blame but themselves, after a long jury debate, essentially our friend Mr. Weinstein, Harvey Weinstein, found guilty. And again, talking about a ship sailing. When he was at his pinnacle, I saw him hosting, because he just bought his way on, to the Larry King show. And at that point, I thought to myself, is he the most unattractive person? Not just like, he's a guy you'd see him at a restaurant, a deli, with like, half half his tuna fish sandwich coming out of his mouth. He's a disgusting person. I feel no empathy or sympathy for him, and he's an abuser of women. He used his power. Bon voyage.
Yeah, I have contacts over at the Motion Picture Association of America, and they told me, yeah, none of this came as a surprise to them. Everybody in Hollywood knew what he was doing, and they quietly
Including Hillary.
Yes, and they quietly condoned it because he made everybody money. He was able to turn out big movies that made money, so the studios kept him happy and kept quiet. He funneled millions upon millions to the DNC and Democratic candidates, so they kept quiet. This was the ultimate cover up. And, now I hope he gets sent to jail for a long, long time.
Yeah, and just like an egotist, an sociopath, all of a sudden he's singing the blues. But how many lives did he ruin? Bon voyage, Mr. Weinstein, you self-righteous piece of shit. Then we also have, on kind of in the media spectrum here, the Five. I think this is interesting because the Five, it's a Fox show, is now the number one largest audience of any non-sports cable show. And I think it's interesting. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it, but I think it is still interesting. It's a show, roundtable. There's a lot of jocularity, joking around. It does talk about the news, but I think, and I like your take on this, I think the big takeaway for me is that that's kind of the formula that people are looking for, because the news is so bad. You have Swiss cheese brain as president. That hard news show like Tucker, still popular, but went from the number one ranking viewership on Fox to number two. And I think there's something to be said for that. It's just, you don't want to be reminded. You need a little humor because the news is so bad. You don't need to know that we're a minute away from nuclear Armageddon. Your thoughts?
I think there's more to it than that. I think, Tucker Carlson's fall to number two is partially the Five's popularity, but also partially because Tucker Carlson has a habit of going off the deep end. I don't watch him, but I've seen promos just this week where he's talking about, is an alien invasion coming next year? This is stuff that nobody really cares about. Well, the reason I think the Five works so well is that, one, yes, they do have that jocularity. And let's not forget that for a long time, we've got generations of people who were getting their news from The Daily Show. We're getting their news from the late night talk shows. And now that those late night talk shows have fallen by the wayside in terms of any kind of value, they're looking for something else. But the other thing that works with the Five is that there is always a variety of viewpoints. There's conservative viewpoints, there's liberal viewpoints. And yes, they will make fun of each other on the air, and they will go at each other. And very often it's a lot funnier than Saturday Night Live. But they have the whole story. It's always not just the right viewpoint, not just the left viewpoint. You're getting it all, and you're getting all that information in an entertaining format. So I think it's a combination of those things.
I think, Dr. Lockett, I'm so happy we put that on the docket.
Because you're 100% correct. And it goes back to our terrestrial radio days, that was a huge opportunity that CNN squandered because they had it. And I think you're right. Yeah, the fun, all that. Yeah, that is a factor. I'm not going to walk away from that. Absolutely. But it's that whole interchange between viewpoints that's missing. I mean, MSNBC, you essentially need to be on acid to watch that because it's just so out of control. Rachel Maddow, I think she's gone, but what have you, it's a joke. People want some interplay between viewpoints, and I think that's beyond, and I think you're correct, it's beyond the humor or the jocularity of the whole thing. It's that people like an interchange because most people are somewhere in the middle. And that's CNN's what they didn't realize. They squandered that.
I'm hoping that the new management of CNN does understand that. And they do seem to be making some changes.
Well,
that I believe.
A turtle, Dr. Lockett, a pace of a turtle.
Well, but again, I mean, this is a huge organization. It's basically like turning an aircraft carrier. It doesn't move quickly. And they're also redoing all of Warner Brothers at the same time.
Okay.
So yeah, it's going to take them a while, but I think they're starting to realize that they do have this golden opportunity to be that actual news organization that they once were.
And it goes back to the point we said this 10, 12 years ago on terrestrial radio, that they had an amazing marketing positioning opportunity. But how do you get people like Zucker? He's supposed to be a media savvy. The guy was an incompetent moron.
He was, and again, we've talked about him. He failed upwards. He did an amazing job at the Today Show, making it the top morning show. I don't know if it still is, and so NBC promoted him to head of prime time, and at that point, he brought NBC from first place to losing on a regular basis to Telemundo. And I'm not joking about that. That's actually true. And then he took over the whole network and it all fell apart. And when he couldn't do any more damage there, for some reason, CNN hired him and he destroyed that network. And hopefully his career is done and the damage that he's done will fall by the wayside and people will realize they need to fix it.
Isn't it a bigger issue, though? Remember my corporate days. You had people that were idiots, buffoons. And once you reach a certain level, you still have security. You could F up a wet dream and you still can go to another company because you're Billy Bob VP of marketing. And I think that has to change, that mentality.
That does have to change. I think part of it is, it's easy to assume, well, he did the job at that company, he can do it here, and they don't really do real due diligence on candidates at that level. But I think also part of it is the fact that once you reach that level, you know where all the bodies are buried. So it's sort of a quid pro quo. It's like, yeah, you keep me employed. I won't tell anybody what I know. And that needs to go away also.
And it's very also indicative of what we talked about earlier on the podcast, the whole entrenched political state in this country. I think the same morons fail upwards. Look at Nancy Pelosi. She's most of it an abject failure, but she keeps on failing upwards. And that's not just her. It's, like you said, FBI, CIA, and I think for this country, that mentality has to change.
Yeah, and again, we've been talking about it in terms of politics, but it does happen in the corporate world. Just as there's a DC swamp, there's also a high-level corporate swamp, and we need to. Now, the corporate swamp is harder to maintain because small businesses and tend to disrupt industries, and if you're stuck in the corporate swamp, you tend not to react well to those disruptions and either go out of business or you have to buy new people and bring new companies in. So it's harder for them to maintain it, but it's still there. But we need to
No,
get
but what you
rid of
said
these
needs to be
entrenched.
acknowledged because
Yes.
you're right. Because there's a self-cleaning mechanism in the private sector. It's true. Yeah, the good old boys, so to speak, corporations, the bloated corporations, guess what? They're no longer with us, and rightfully so. But in D.C., you don't have that.
Yeah, I mean, there's still bloated corporations out there.
No, I
Let's
get
not,
it, but I
yeah,
mean,
let's
you
not
still have that
oversimplify.
cleansing
But
mechanism.
yeah, the fact is, innovation changes corporations a lot faster than it changes politics. And in fact, politicians tend to do everything they can to avoid those disruptions because it means they have to give up power. So, yeah, corporations do tend to self clean faster than politicians do, but the same problem exists.
Rightfully so, yes. Um, on the economic front, 70% of economists predict, and I don't think you need an MIT economics degree to predict that, but they've predicted a 70% chance of a recession in the next year. Um, Two questions for you. Do you agree with that? Number two, if that's in fact what you do believe, what political ramifications does it have?
I do believe we are heading into another recession next year. The two figures that concern me the most are, well, three actually, are the participation rate in the labor market. There are far too many people dropping out of the labor market, not going to work.
I love that point. Please tell, from your opinion, why is that the case? We talked about this, in our podcast prep, that in at least two states, Washington and Massachusetts, that if you have a family of four, if being on the doles equal to $100,000, and I'll even go beyond that, is you got better health care than most workers. So that's my little interjection. But why do you
Yeah,
think
that is the reason. Because there are you mentioned New Jersey and Massachusetts, but there's also 14 states that the benefits are equal to $80,000 a year. So
And
why?
that's to put in perspective, the median income in America is 60.
Right.
60.
So these people are saying, well, I can get government payouts and not have to work. And you know what? I've been home for 2 years. I don't want to go back to an office. I don't want to have to work. So, but that is not sustainable. So you've got these out of control benefits keeping people out of the workforce. So that's one
Yeah, but doesn't it
factor.
serve the Democratic Party to have that as an actuality? They're
Oh,
not going
of
to
course.
vote Republican. What are you, crazy?
No. And I have actually spoken to people who have said, "Oh, of course I'm going to vote for the Democrats. They're giving me money." So yeah, the Democrats want this going. Now, a lot of states are going to run out of that money. You can't keep that up for too much longer. California, one of these generous states, went from having a surplus to being in a deficit again. I'm sure you're going to see that in more states, and those benefits will go away. And then these people are going to have to explain to employers as they apply for jobs why they stayed out of the workforce for 2.5, 3
Okay,
years.
let me comment on a couple things. There are certain things and very few things I claim to know in my old age, but a couple things I really do know, and I can write it down in indelible ink. If you are out of work for more than a year without some really amazing excuse, check, please. If you're hanging out for 2 years and I don't know what you can say in an interview, maybe you can make something up, you're writing a novel, but I think this is a fascinating and an underreported phenomenon in America. All these people getting these amazing
benefits, 80 grand, 80, I mean, 100 is out of control. Eventually, like everything in life, for every action, there is a reaction. And you're 30 years old, and you're now the gravy train has stopped. When you go face your employer, and this labor shortage is not going to go on forever, you may be there is something, and it doesn't exist now, but it has over time when you become unemployable.
That's very true. And I think the big problem, and this is a problem of human perception, people tend to believe what's going on right now will always be. And we've heard this over and over again. When the Republicans lost to Obama and lost the House and the Senate, you heard Democrats saying, "Oh, this is the end of the Republican Party. They're never going to recover from this." And then when Trump came in and the Republicans won the House and Senate, the Republicans, "Oh, this is the end of the Democrats. They're never going to recover from." It always goes in cycles. They always recover, they always come back, and you have to pay the piper for what you did during that time. So you've got these people who are going to be unemployable.
But
And
before you would know, before you get on to, because I love what you're saying, but it needs a little more articulation. When you're 30 years old, no one's unemployable. I mean, I'm talking about upwardly mobile employment, like real employment. If you get a job at Burger King, I get it. So let's be clear. But what does that mean for our economy? What does that mean for America from our social economic perspective when you have an entire group of people that are now in, let's just say, their prime social and political and economic lives that are now essentially unemployable?
yeah, it's going to crater our economy, point blank, because as each generation enters the workforce, they bring new ideas, they push things forward. And this was true up until the millennials, because the millennials came in and they didn't want jobs that they actually created products they didn't want manufacturing jobs. They didn't want jobs that were actually valuable to the economy. They wanted to be social media influencers. They wanted to be pop stars, and there's a great book that I've mentioned on the podcast before, The Burnout Generation, that interviewed a number of these folks. And the problem was that they're all burnt out because the world didn't conform to their perceptions. They wanted to be able to make $100,000 a year being a social media influencer. And
Being
yes,
AOC.
right. And
AOC
while it
is an example of that. Someone that happened to make it, so to speak, as a congressperson. But if she didn't win, she would just be some TikTok moron working at a bar.
Right, and the problem is
with a BU degree.
The problem with this is that there are examples of success, but for every successful person that did that, there are thousands of people that failed miserably, and probably hundreds of thousands that realized they weren't going to do this and actually moved on to other things. So you have, and now if they can't do that and they can't get jobs because their skills are now 3 and 4 years out of date, that's going to crater the economy. And this is why you hear uh, Democrats, especially, but I've heard it from some Republicans too, why they want open borders and why they want more people coming in, because we don't have enough people here to actually do the work we need to keep the country running. And they think
we have enough people. We don't have enough people with any initiative.
Yes, that's just it. They say we don't have enough people. We have plenty of people. The number of people is not the problem. It's the number of people that actually want to work. And the fact of the matter is, if you take a look at America, going back 200 years, America has been built by immigrants because they came here and they wanted to work. And the big problem with the border crisis is not that there are immigrants coming in that want to work, it's that the number of immigrants that are coming in that want to work is only 50% of the number of people coming in. And you have cartels coming in. And we know this from the number of people that come in and then turn themselves over to Border Patrol so they can be processed. And that's only 50%. The other 50% run away, avoid the Border Patrol, and enter the country with no legal status. And that's the problem at the border.
Yeah, but
And
isn't it a bigger problem that you have a country club that everyone wants to get into? It's called the United States. You could have your pick of the litter, and this is indicative of the incompetency in Washington. You could have your pick of the litter of any ethnic group, any geographic region, Africa, Europe, you name it, the best and the brightest, but no, you can't put that together in a coherent policy that's indicative of how stupid our ruling elite is.
yeah,
Dumb.
I think that problem is more an issue of Republicans and Democrats refusing to actually work together for the good of the country.
Well, there you go.
Immigration certainly isn't the only example of that. But if these people don't get together and actually say, all right, we have to work for the good of America, not the good of our party, then that's just going to keep happening. But going back to the recession where all of this started, so that participation rate is a big problem. The another big problem that we're facing is the productivity rate. Productivity is dropping at the fastest rate, I believe, since 1974. And when you don't have a high participation rate, and those people who are participating aren't productive, that's a big drag on the economy. And the other big factor that I see is the falling of consumer confidence. Spending is starting to fall by the wayside now. Spending had been keeping us going for the last several years. That's starting to fall. Now you're seeing savings starting to drop and credit card usage up because people can't keep up. Again, like the participation rate in staying out of work, this is not sustainable. And unfortunately, I think we're on track for all of these things to collapse pretty close to the same time. And that's what's going to cause the recession.
You are correct, sir. Excellent. And by the way, 1974 might have been a pretty decent year for music. Economically, it was a disaster. There
Yes.
you go. So, moving on, we have our esteemed President Joe Biden, Uncle Joe, Lunch Pail, Aviator Joe. Not just a gaff machine, but a serial liar. He's always been. He's got some issues. Talking about issues, he just has some real issues. Talked about his uncle. Who even knows? Who cares? That when he was vice president. I mean, to make this stuff. If you had a friend that made this shit up, you'd be like, buddy, you need some help. So anyway, his uncle, brother, not brother, uncle, cousin, whatever, hit the beach in Normandy, got wounded, and it was Uncle Joe that, when he became vice president, gave him his much deserved Purple Heart. Is there a medic?
Yeah, and of course, as it turns out, none of this story is
None of it's
true.
true. Just like he
And
was a professor
this,
at UPenn, sharing his great
yeah,
intellect with the Ivy
and
League
this
world.
is amazing. This is amazing to me that he keep. I mean, politicians lie all the time, but Biden keeps getting caught lying about things he doesn't need to lie about. And in fact, the Washington Post has given him a perpetual 5 Pinocchios because he tells so many lies. They've decided he's not even worth fact checking anymore. They're just assuming his stories are lies.
Oh, and that's another reason why I believe he hasn't done a press conference since February, because I think it's getting worse, and they know he can just go out on a tangent and talk about when he talked to UFOs and blah blah blah. I think it's
Well,
become
the media is up in arms now because they covered his ass for so long. Now he's giving interviews to Drew Barrymore, who wouldn't know an issue if it bit her on the ass. And
whoa
instead of
whoa whoa whoa
asking,
whoa whoa. She's a seventh grade graduate. What are you talking about?
I mean, yeah, it's in, but this is who they're giving interviews to. And of course, instead of asking anything of substance, she put Biden, Jill, and Joe through her own version of the newlywed game. And this is, and established media is up in arms because he won't sit down with most of them because they actually want to ask him about policy and he can't answer.
Well, isn't it really kind of funny in a kind of satirical way that's the level his handlers? Just think about this. Drew Barrymore, a decent actress, whatever, not the brightest bulb in the Christmas tree in any way. That's what they're saying. Joe, do one. I mean, why don't you do with Kermit the Frog? Essentially, it's the same. They're
Actually,
basically telling.
I think Kermit the Frog would have been more intelligent, but
Yeah, I agree.
mean,
But the point
this
is,
was
his
absolutely
handlers are telling him that they're basically admitting that this guy is kaput.
yeah, he can't deal with any kind of conflict. He starts getting angry. So, of course, they're cherry picking the interviews to people who are going to toss him softballs, who aren't going to follow up on anything he says. Because, of course, if you follow up, he can't keep his lies straight. And then they're putting out this ridiculous crap, and it'll work for the next year and a half. But if he actually wants to hit the campaign trail, eventually he's going to have to answer a question.
That's the big elephant in the room. I think there's so much BS bullshit. Plus, you dovetail that, juxtapose that to the coming recession. And again, I talked about this several weeks ago. Nixon survived Watergate until the economy imploded in '73. I think, Uncle Joe, Aviator Joe, Numbnuts Joe is great until you don't have a job. Speaking of Mr. Biden, we also have the situation coming out that in the March to June, the administration claimed over 1 million jobs were created, and this is crazy. The actual fact is 10,000.
Yeah, Biden has made so many ridiculous claims about
10,000 is like a
inflation,
joke.
about unemployment. I don't even think he understands the data at this point. And so, of course, he makes up these numbers, which never turn out to be true. Remember, he was saying, his comment about inflation not too long ago was, oh, it only went up an inch.
An inch.
It's he's absolutely
it is absolutely amazing, and it's indicative of an administration that has no rudder. I hope he gets through this intact, but we don't know. He did say off the record, meaning, go ahead.
Honestly, I think this is the reason that Jen Psaki left the White House and went to MSNBC, because there was only so much spin even she could put on this bullshit. And Lord knows her successor's an abject fool.
Yeah. So she doesn't even know that they're both Tweedledum, Tweedledee. So they're perfect for each other because she doesn't even know she's lying because she doesn't even know what reality is. But Biden did say on a off-mic moment that hot mic moment, I should say, that the Iran nuclear deal is dead. That's probably but the only intelligent thing he said for the last month. Only John Kerry, the moron of morons, would think that the nuke deal is something you should pursue. Even
Honestly,
Biden knows it's dead.
the nuke deal was dead before it started. Because what everybody always seems to forget is the reason that Donald Trump was able to pull out of the deal is because a treaty needs to be ratified by Congress. And Obama's original deal was never ratified by Congress. So Trump was able to just pull out of it. Biden was negotiating this new deal, or Kerry was negotiating it. But the fact of the matter is, they never had the votes in Congress to ratify it. So it was dead on arrival. It didn't matter what was in it, it was never going to be ratified. Now
Actually,
that the
you have an amazing point, Dr. Lotkin, because for any now AOC would vote for it, or these numbnuts, the squad, but any rational person, not even if they hated Israel, which is a growing part of the Democratic Party, would know it is political suicide to vote for something as asinine as the Iran nuclear deal. Am I not correct?
so this was always beating a dead horse. And when the Republicans took power in the House, that was the end of it, because then Biden couldn't even pretend that he had the support for it.
Agreed. Closing on a not a lighter note, the 40th, 50th anniversary, excuse me, of something called the Immaculate Reception, which was a game which really propelled the Pittsburgh Steelers to their amazing 1970s domination, was a catch that was basically bounced off another player that Franco Harris picked up. He was the running back of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the only reason I mention that is kind of uncanny that they were going to celebrate this amazing feat. I think they were going to have a Christmas game, or maybe I think it was a Christmas game between the actual teams that participated in this 50 years ago, and they were going to honor Franco Harris, and he actually died today.
Yeah, I don't remember the actual play. I think I was 3 at the time.
There you go.
But yeah, Franco Harris actually had an amazing career. And athletes back then were very different than they are now. Now they're arguing over millions of dollars in salary, and then most of them had to have a second job just to survive. And
Yes.
they were playing for the love of the game. And I think this play, and Frank Harris in general, was indicative of the type of athlete that you had
No
back then.
question.
It was full steam ahead. We're doing everything we can to win. It's all about the game, all about the team, and he'll be missed. And unfortunately, it's a dying breed. We don't have athletes like that anymore.
No question. Well, when you're 26 years old, I'm a competitive person, but if I was 26 years old and I'm making 13, 15, 20 million dollars a year, yeah, I'll compete. And if I lose, do I really give a shit? I think it's gone way out of control. But this will be our last podcast for the year. I think it's been a great year. I've enjoyed our back and forth over the year, and I think it was a great year for Carnivore Radio. Do you agree?
It has been. We've been picked up by new platforms. We've been growing in listeners. And of course, we always want to hear from our listeners. So, those of you who want to tell us what you think about all these issues, you can go to xvadio.com/connect and send us a message. Let us know what's going on in your minds. And yeah, 2022 has been a roller coaster year. It's been absolutely amazing. And of course, we've been doing this between the podcast and terrestrial radio for over 10 years already. We've seen so many ups and downs. And I can't wait to see what 2023 brings.
I would agree, and it's been an absolute pleasure corresponding with you and doing the show. And I look forward to 2023. Dr. Lockton, thank you very much. Have a great new year and a great holiday season.
And the same to our listeners. Happy holidays, happy Hanukkah, happy Kwanzaa, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Whatever you want to celebrate, go out and celebrate. Because the fact that you survived 2022 is worth celebrating.
That's cause for celebration, yes. Thank you, Dr. Lockton. I'll see you next year.
We will see you next year. And remember, you can catch every episode of Carnivore Bites at the Carnivore Radio website, xvadio.com/podcasts, the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Amazon Music, Audible, and other platforms that respect freedom of speech. Have a fantastic 2022 wrap up. We'll see you next year.
Thank you, Dr. Lockton. Take care.